To close out our conference today, we've decided to welcome back some of the speakers from our 2022 conference who joined us then to discuss U.S.-China strategic and trade relations. This year, we tweaked the title a bit to discuss U.S.-China trade and national security, which is front and center for U.S. policymakers in 2023. Since we're virtual today on the internet, we won't need a big balloon to watch what's happening with our closing session. But if you have one flying overhead and you're listening in, you can hear today's speakers talk about some very important issues in U.S.-China relations. I'd like to welcome on Amy Selico, principal at Albright Stonebridge Group and Denton's Global Advisors. Amy was a former senior director for China Affairs at USTR. Sam Sachs, senior fellow at the Yale Law School Paul Tsai China Center at New America. Scott Kennedy, senior advisor and trustee chair in China Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And one of my oldest friends in Washington, Aaron Ennis, senior vice president of government affairs at Dell Technologies. Aaron and I met as Senate staffers back when Japan was front and center for trade policymakers, and China had yet to join the WTO, a different era indeed, Aaron. Take it away.
All right, thank you. That's quite a lead in, and nice attempt on the balloon joke. We'll see how many puns we get in the next hour on some of these things. So I'm very pleased to be invited back to have these conversations. You know, Ken and I had talked about what the topic of this panel discussion might be probably about a month or so ago, and there was literally no way that we would have known that this week would have been so integral in terms of thinking through what's going on in U.S.-China, not only economic relations, but national security issues. These are things that are so intertwined. So I thought maybe what we could do is to kick off the discussion is, you know, maybe take this back to the context that a lot of folks on participating in the audience on this call might have things. And that is back in the day, back when Ken was referring to, and probably even 5-10 years ago, you know, there used to be in the trade world that we would talk about the fact that there was a line between trade and economic issues and national security issues. Does that distinction still exist, or is everything now a national security issue? Amy, let me come to you first. What are your thoughts? Is there still trade and economic interests that are separate at this point?
Well, it's great to be with everybody today, my fellow panelists and all of you in the audience. And Aaron, I'm so glad you're steering us through this conversation today, given, as Ken said, we've got added excitement over the past week. Let me just say, I'll just, start with that. The China surveillance balloon incident that we are talking about and that is impacting the ability of the U.S. and China to get back on track in directly discussing issues of concern, whether they're trade issues, national security issues, or what I will say, the intertwined set of issues between the U.S. and China. It underscores just how fraught the relationship is. And for many of us, as you just said, Aaron, we have seen this play before. There have been issues that have tried, some successfully, some less so, really to derail U.S.-China relations and dialogue about many, many issues of importance that the relationship faced. I was at the State Department both in 1999 and in 2001, 1999 during the Clinton administration, of course, when the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade happened. And then in 2001, I was an economic officer in Shanghai when the EP3 incident happened, leading to a U.S. aircraft, surveillance aircraft, having to have an emergency landing on Hainan Island. Those two military incidents had the potential to completely derail U.S.-China relations and to spiral into significant military crisis, and neither did. And part of the reason for that, of course, all of us going back in history, is recalling where we were in 1999 and 2001 with China. We were engaged in very substantial talks about finalization of China joining the WTO. And as Ken just said, that's ancient history now, thinking about the times before China was in WTO. But I underscore it at the beginning of this conversation, just to use the muscle memory of we have dealt with significant crises before because we had so many other issues that bound us together, or more recently, issues of common concern where we need to cooperate. Those issues of common concern are even being undermined by the deep and deepening levels of mistrust between the US and China. And the surveillance balloon incident really does underscore again what I've just said, that the relationship really is quite fraught, but that the relationship needs these channels of communication to deal with crisis. And whether it's an economic issue, let's all please remember, we just logged record trade numbers between the US and China in 2022. Whether it's dealing with a fraught economic relationship, many of those topics discussed by the former panel, or national security considerations, and the issue of surveillance activities that both the US and China engage in. We need to have this idea that we can talk about both trade and national security issues together with one another, or else we are just going to continue to get closer and closer to an accident or an incident leading to a crisis. Like it or not, these issues are linked, and we have to keep talking about them together.
All right, Amy, that was a very sobering start. I somehow doubt that either Scott or Sam are going to bring us away from that. So Scott, let me turn to you next. Trade and economic issues and national security, one and the same at this point, or is there still a distinction?
Well, thanks, Aaron. And it's great to be here with you, Amy, and Sam, and to the conference again, and to chat about these issues. I'm not going to be much more optimistic than Amy, but I'll try and take a slightly different approach and go back to Japan. I think we've seen two really big shifts in why these two areas of trade and national security are almost one and the same now. And that is when we were going through this dance with Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, we were strategic allies. We had concerns about the competitiveness of American industries and unfair Chinese-Japanese trade and investment practices and market access problems, but it was really seen as an economic issue. In addition, also during that time, that was really the beginning of America's love affair of interdependence and complex supply chains and building them out and moving investment abroad and, creating the world that we've been living in the last 40 years. And so we really had a relatively narrow, confined fight with the Japanese, and it was all about fair trade, right? Anti-dumping margins, and all of that kind of stuff, which half of the folks on here know either because they're trade lawyers or they called upon a trade lawyer to deal with those kinds of things. As we've gotten closer to the current date, those two things have changed. One is China is not in our camp, right? We are not strategic allies, quite different. And as China has become more powerful, and as China's ambitions for creating the type of world that it wants has increased and obviously not aligned with ours, that raises significant concerns. The second thing is that we've fallen out of love with interdependence. We now see interdependence as primarily something that creates vulnerabilities for us, as opposed to creating common interests that restrain bad actors and give them a commitment to keeping tensions below a certain threshold. Now we've believe that interdependence is about costing us jobs. It's about making us vulnerable. And so therefore it's very difficult to say that issue is definitely only a commercial access issue. That issue is definitely a national security. Unfortunately, we're now closer to the Chinese view that these two things are one and the same. And I think that makes a super big challenge for us to figure out what our policies should be, because essentially it means we're playing defense on every front at the same time.
Thanks, Scott. Sam, you are not a trade person, but you are a tech person. But certainly that line between economic security and national security comes up a lot, I know, in discussions that you have. What's your view of where that line is currently?
We look at the framing of the US-China relationship in the national security strategy, and we follow it to its natural conclusion. You really cannot separate economic competitiveness risks from national security risks, because the PRC is framed as being America's most consequential geopolitical challenge and source of competition. And I want to just, Aaron, you and I have talked a lot about how helpful it can be sometimes to put a concrete example on the table to understand these abstract concepts. So I want to give an example from the tech sector to show how these lines are blurring. When we think about where we put restrictions and the justifications around those restrictions on Chinese firms or on data, for example. One of the comments that I have heard from former and current administration officials is, sometimes, I'll say, well, is the justification that allowing commercial engagement with a particular Chinese firm or allowing a particular Chinese application to handle Americans' data? I see the economic competitiveness implications of that, but I think the national security arguments are a bit more tenuous. And the response really is, but if you see China as the biggest geostrategic competitor, then aren't they blurred, right? So in the past, when we used things like export controls or entity listings, it was narrowly focused on military end use. Does a particular firm or user have a higher risk of sharing that dual use technology with the military end user? Is there a defense industry sort of entity relationship there? Now, the articulation is less that this controlled item would go to the military per se, but that it would enhance China's technological capability more broadly, even in areas that may not have direct military application, from biotech to renewable energy and other sort of broader uses. So in that framing of, this kind of data would enable a Chinese firm not linked to the military, but would enable them to have a competitive advantage in developing this technology in third countries, not just the US or China, that becomes a national security issue because it challenges the dominance of US firms in these strategic tech sectors. And to refer to Jake Sullivan's comments before the October export control package, he shifted the model from this being about, does China get a relative gain, to getting an absolute gain. And when you frame technological competition in terms of it becomes a national security issue to have absolute gain itself, I think that those lines are just inevitably going to blur.
Thanks, Sam. All right, so we've got a lot of somewhat agreement, although maybe for a little bit different reasons on some of these things. Amy, I want to come back to you because I feel like the point that you made is one that we're all seeing play out in real time. If we can't find ways to address these issues, then bad things could happen. To paraphrase you, yours was a little more eloquent than that when you said it. But I'm just wondering, are there realistic options at this point for the two governments to not only reduce tensions, which seems like a minimum that needs to happen, not just in this situation, but probably overall. But we do, of course, have outstanding issues between both governments' views of trade policies, economic policies, and national security policy for that matter. Are there realistic options to pursue some of those?
I think there absolutely are. I mean, the reality is, despite the fragility in areas of common cause between the two sides and just the real fragility in the state of the relationship, I do think there are stakeholders in both governments coming from starting from the top on down who have reiterated the need to engage in order to, as we continuously say here in Washington, put a floor underneath this deterioration so that the deterioration doesn't lead to a crisis that's in no one's interest. And so, just getting really practical really fast here, I think it was actually helpful that the Commerce Department on Friday, targeted 6 entities, put them on the entity list. And these were specific entities that were supporting China's military's development of surveillance technology. And so again, trying to say, okay, we are deeply disturbed by what is happening, and we are going to try to prevent that from continuing to happen. Okay, action. And then from that, we can then talk about how does Secretary Blinken engage with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, which is going to happen later this week. These, we do have to have an action-reaction because we're facing domestic politics. I think that's what's underlying a lot about your question, Aaron. How realistic is it, given domestic politics in both countries, for us to be engaging? It's challenging. It's very challenging. I think the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson today, talking about American surveillance balloons flying over China, while China continues not to refer to those balloons as for surveillance purposes in the United States, is just an example of, I think, Beijing being, on its heels, trying to figure out a reaction to this incident. And we have to just get through it together. That is the challenge of having a crisis where you don't have confidential channels of communication to try to discuss these things. And so a lot of the reaction and then response is happening publicly. I look forward to our two governments, which do absolutely have channels and that are being used right now at a higher level to re-engage privately on a way forward. Because let's face it, the stakes are too high for us just to say, nope, we're not going to deal with these issues with one another. We'll try to work around them. You can't, when it's about national security and then about the economic relationship and that overlay of national security that pervades it right now.
Amy, those are great points, and it brings to mind that the U.S. is hosting APEC this year, which means that there will be a summit here, which means that leaders will be coming here, and as you and I both have experienced, those kinds of meetings, if President Xi were to attend, sometimes can help to focus the mind in terms of those private conversations. So thank you, excellent points. Scott, let me maybe take a little bit of a different angle for my follow-up question to you. And before I pose that question, I see several people are putting questions into the Q&A box. Please keep doing that. I'm going to ask one more question of each of the panelists, and then I'm going to start turning to your questions. So please submit everything you got, and I'll group them together, but get through as many as I possibly can. So Scott, to you on this one. There has been a lot of action since October, probably is the most polite way to say, in terms of what the U.S. is seeking to do to potentially define what I believe the previous panel referred to at various points as the small yard, high fences idea, that we identify where the scope is that we want to be able to restrict, but we put in significant barriers to it as a way to prevent China from getting the advanced technology that we might want to have. The most recent iteration of that, of course, were the restrictions back in October on the advanced semiconductor restrictions. But China's been pursuing innovation policies for many, many years. You've watched the Chinese economy develop, not only over the years, but very specifically in some of these areas. Are these restrictions causing China to recognize that it simply is not going to ever be a leader in this area? Or is it having a different effect in terms of incentivizing them to push even harder into these
areas? That's a great a great question. And, I was in China in September and October for 6 weeks when Jake Sullivan gave his speech on September 16th that Sam referred to, and when those regulations came out on October 7th that you just mentioned. And I had an opportunity to ask lots of people about what the consequences of these were going to be, including Chinese officials, as well as high-tech startups, folks that work in AI that use these chips. Before I tell you what they said, I think just for context, it's really important for folks to know, yeah, China does import a lot of tech, but it is an innovator itself, big time. China is now officially, unofficially, it's ranked 11th according to the Global Innovation Index of innovators. And in fact, what's interesting in the last few years is that the efficiency of Chinese innovation has expanded. We also always used to focus on all the inputs that go in, all the money and effort that goes into this and little output. But now the Chinese are generating significant innovations on the output side. They look as efficient in terms of innovation as just about anybody else, not just applications, but basic research across a whole wide range of areas. So we're not talking about turning the lights out and putting China back in the Stone Age if with these restrictions. They are already significant in a number of industries. When I talked to Chinese about this, the further I went up the political hierarchy, the further I went up the corporate hierarchy, the more optimistic they were that these restrictions would be significant blows, but they would get around them. And essentially sort of bring it on. We can handle this. The further you go down in the political hierarchy, further down in the firm towards researchers and people that make technical decisions, the more worried they were that these restrictions were going to bite, both on the types of chips that they needed for the various applications that they're working on, as well as the kinds of equipment and tools that they're going to increasingly be denied, which will allow them to innovate in new spaces. But you add onto the hardware restrictions, potential restrictions in financing, with the outward CFIUS that was talked about, companies that are moving production out of China or diversifying and changing and not having necessarily their best stuff there. China has managed to innovate in part on top of their manufacturing prowess, being central to supply chains, and that may be shifting. And then workforce, as the global workforce begins to shift, as there are less Chinese getting PhDs in American universities, working in American firms, that will all in some way impact China's ability to innovate. So broadly speaking, net slow the Chinese down in some areas, but it's also going to hurt us too. We benefit innovation-wise, not just from dollars, from the collaborations that we have with China. And so I think it's a question of which line is going to move further down. Is it China's innovation line and trajectory, or ours that's going to take a significant hit by this approach? Because there's other ways to figure out how to address the question that Sam mentioned about the relative versus absolute gains. Part of it is about slowing the other side down, but there's also ways in which we can accelerate what we're doing, and that acceleration may actually be accentuated by the global connectivity that we have. So I think we need to do a full balance sheet to figure out which mix of policies both help us keep advantages, but also in a way where we have absolute improvements in our innovation as well. And I think that's a big part of the missing conversation in Washington at the moment.
Great, thanks, Scott. Sam, I'm gonna pivot. We're gonna come back to the outbound investment one, because not only did Scott raise it, but there's a couple of questions that I'll come back to that are in the queue here. But Sam, pivoting a little bit, maybe to one of those other areas that I know you've done a lot of looking into, of where there's differences in policies and who is moving faster or more aggressively than others. China has a variety of data and cybersecurity related measures that go into effect this year. I have seen you testify before talking about the fact that the U.S. needs its own policies in these areas, and we need to protect U.S. citizen data as well. But China is clearly moving ahead on these things right now. A lot of those first reviews for all companies are due in the coming weeks. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of how the Chinese government is looking at these applications. And is there any distinction between how they're viewing applications that are coming in from Chinese companies and their plans to protect data of Chinese citizens versus those that foreign and particularly American companies might be seeing?
Thanks, Erin. I marvel at the fact that we are now over half a decade out from implementation of the cybersecurity law, and yet we still don't know some of the answers to how the biggest issues will be resolved and how they will be implemented and enforced. So we had, and now over a year ago, the landmark data security and personal information protection laws. And yet to your question, Erin, we are waiting to see how the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, is going to respond on one of those issues in particular, which has to do with outbound transfers of data. And I think what maybe I'll do is I'll take the question in two parts, because this sort of regulatory regime is so sweeping in scope. You have parts of it that have to do with how data is managed. You have parts that have to do with cross-border data flows. And then separately, there are dozens of regulations and standards related to broader information communications technology, supply chain issues, supply chain risk, and information systems. On the data side, I would say that when we look at the so-called tech crackdown in China, we could talk a little bit later about that and its future. But the primary enforcement actions related to how China's regulators were looking at the issue of data security were focused on Chinese domestic companies. They were primarily focused on the large domestic internet platforms. Now, that doesn't mean that multinationals, US firms are off the hook entirely. And I think one of the big questions we're waiting for is how will the CAC choose to respond to requests for outbound data transfers? And what will that mean for domestic versus foreign firms? The way that these rules are written are completely country agnostic. So there's no indication that foreign firms would necessarily be discriminated against. I think both domestic and foreign companies are concerned about the scope of what kinds of data will be compelled to reside on servers in country. The CAC issued its first public approvals for outbound data transfers the other week, and we found out that they had approved outbound data transfers related to a joint cancer research study with the Netherlands, as well as for Air China, which is interesting and gives you a sense of sort of priorities, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what that means for more typical commercial transactions. I can share what I've heard anecdotally, and this is what I'm watching. This could go two directions. Will regulators take a sort of overly broad interpretation of what data counts as quote unquote important data? In the absence of more specific definition around that, will they choose to be risk averse and just overclassify, and therefore more data would have to be stored in country? Or it's possible that the gray zones, the so-called slack in the system in this area, which has allowed a tremendous amount of cross-border commerce and outbound data flows, even since the cybersecurity law, that gray zone will continue. So I think we'll get some more indications of that as we see the CAC's response to those self-assessments by companies in the weeks ahead. On the broader ICT supply chain risk, here's where I see China and the US really mirroring each other, to be honest. Both countries are increasingly worried about, to return to Scott's point about interdependence being viewed as a source of vulnerability and something that can be weaponized. The Chinese government also sees supply chain interdependence, particularly in the wake of various export controls and the like being used, right? So they are now trying to double down on making their own supply chains resilient to these external geopolitical shocks. I think the difference, however, is that for years, for any multinational operating in China has known that there is a perception that domestic equals more secure. This goes back to the years old phrase, secure and controllable. And while there was no official definition that was seen as favorable to domestic companies, in practice, it often was viewed that way. Quickly to wrap up, what I'm watching now on this issue, particularly related to foreign versus domestic firms, we have not seen retaliation yet by the Chinese government in terms of trying to exact a cost on the US business community in China in response to US actions. Could they choose to use some of these data security regulations as a more under the radar way to exact costs? It's possible, although the data points that I've been getting so far anecdotally have been that in conversations with regulators, US firms are finding that they are more interested in preventing US firms from leaving and are looking at ways to, in the geopolitical environment, say, how can we make you want to stay and invest here because we know you're under pressure?
Thank you, Sam. There was a lot in there. And actually, it reminds me, Scott, that when you noted that we have fallen out of love with interdependence, that, you know, tomorrow is Valentine's Day. So I expect all of you to be on Twitter with your trade Valentines, hopefully positive ones, maybe not on this topic, however. Let's go to the questions that I've got in the queue. There were a couple of questions about outbound investment screening. One, with the most, blatant question, and probably the easiest way to view it is, do each of you think that we need an outbound investment review related to China? But then one that kind of dives a little bit deeper into it, because we may not have that choice. All rumors are that the Biden administration is about to put one in, whether you want it or not. So, how consequential do you think that's going to be? And do you think that China will have a response in return? So, Sam, you had previously indicated to me that you might want to tackle this one. I'm going to come back to you first on this one.
All right, maybe I'll start with not the prescriptive recommendation, but more kind of what the state of play is. And I'll defer to Amy and Scott to pick up on that. But my understanding is that there has been tremendous debate, which has prevented the release of this outbound investment EO. My understanding is that the debate really centers on two issues. One, how do you define a US investment? And CSET at Georgetown recently did a really interesting study where they looked at the top capital flows into China. And they think one of their conclusions is that a lot of it was Chinese originated investment going into these VC firms. So if that's the case, if the goal is to limit US investment into China, but a lot of that investment is actually coming from Chinese investors themselves, how do you actually define and scope what a US investor is, right? Second, we've heard speculation that the regime would focus on specific sectors, semiconductors, quantum, biotech, and artificial intelligence. Well, what is artificial intelligence? So how do you bind that? How do you prevent code from crossing borders? And even things like biotech can be quite fraught with debate. Are you saying that cures for cancer that come out of China is something that is not in the US national security interests? Are there ethical ramifications once you put in place guardrails around biotech? And what is that? So my understanding is there's still a lot of grist as this is being formulated. And the reality is, if you want to do this, it's really complicated and is going to require a very robust thought and input from industry at a moment when I think many in the US government, frankly, are allergic to taking input from industry, despite a lot of that knowledge residing there.
Thanks, Sam. Amy, you come off mute. What are your thoughts?
Well, I do think it's inevitable. We're going to see this kind of regime being put in place. And as Sam was just laying out, the question is, how broad will it be and what is the purpose of it? Is it just registration, or is there some kind of reverse CFIUS approval necessary? I think what's interesting to me, just piggybacking on what Sam said, yes, there are the concerns about those questions of scope and purpose going through the EO, but what we're hearing from Congress is that they remain very interested in this issue. And so I think the likelihood of legislation being passed this year, outside of maybe the National Defense Authorization Act at the end of the year, is very low. I do think there's going to be a very active interest in these questions, and the questions that Sam was posing. What kinds of investment, what kinds of investors are we going to be constraining? Because those are the questions that Hill is asking. But I do think that when we talk about biotechnology, I think the jury is still very, very much out, even within the government, about how expansive we want to be. And then on artificial intelligence, I think we do have one ready-made application, surveillance, where there's going to certainly be restrictions in that application, that use of AI. Those are going to certainly see investment, if not restrictions. Again, Erin, the point of the EO is notification, right? And then whether there's going to be a more expansive infrastructure put around that to require approvals, I think we have to wait to see.
Great, thanks. Scott, is this one you want to jump in on?
Yeah, just a little bit. Sam and Amy have given you sort of, substantively what's likely to happen or the big issues. I'll do a little editorializing since they were didn't focus on that. I think we ought to be super careful, right? Let's remember what the challenge is. What we are trying to do is prevent the transfer of certain types of technology or knowledge that will aid China's military or intelligence abilities, or broadly, catch up with us in a way that is obviously dangerous. And I can understand that. So I guess the question is, what is occurring in that realm of transfer of knowledge and technologies that isn't captured by export controls, right? We have a very robust and expanding export control system, and we're about to multilateralize it even further in certain areas. And when you're dealing with foreign investment, if it involves a joint venture, for example, and you put technology or IP into it, that can then be covered by export controls. So really what it comes down to is some private equity firm in New York's got a lot of cash. They have no IP themselves, but they give a bunch of money to a Chinese startup that's making something that then turns into potentially something that makes us more vulnerable. That is probably what one might envision as currently falling through the cracks. So I think we ought to figure out what might be the best way to fill in some of those cracks that don't totally upset things. Because if we simply create a whole new bureaucracy that has a lot of reporting requirements, it will dampen investment in a lot of areas that we want. It's also going to rebound backwards and perhaps affect people's willingness to invest in the United States, including American companies bringing their profits back home. So I think we ought to really be careful and tippy-toe into this because we may end up in a situation where our national security is less protected than more protected.
It's a really interesting point, Scott, and it actually reminds me of kind of a corollary to the topic that I'd asked you about earlier in terms of the advanced semiconductor restrictions. When the U.S. acts alone, there's always a risk of, or also a risk, I guess I should say, of the things that you just described, that we may have a good intention in terms of something that needs to be done to improve national security, but with the unintended consequence of it encouraging people to innovate U.S. technology out so that they aren't covered by those restrictions. Does restrictions and investment have that same effect? I mean, is this the kind of thing that if we do it by ourselves, that we see the innovation moving to other countries who simply don't hold the same level of concern that we do? Or is this something that our allies have been waiting for us to take the first step and feel like by providing more clarity that we're helping to lead the way of where they wanted to go?
Yeah. This reminds me of a story. So sitting in Shanghai at a breakfast with the Chamber of Commerce of another country a few years ago, and we were discussing the potential Trump tariffs, and at that point they said that we don't believe he's going to do it, but if he does, we'll just take your market share. That was the reaction. I think we need to. It turns out now they realize that we're all in this together, broadly speaking, that global tensions that lead to decoupling or bifurcation or what have you ends up having a negative effect on others. But I don't think it's necessarily that different in many areas of foreign investment, where foreign companies from other countries are looking for opportunities. And if their national security evaluation is different than ours, then we will be on a different page. I don't think we ought to assume that those that have a different view than us simply don't care about national security. You know, evaluations, countries can have different evaluations of the risks of doing business with Huawei, legitimate differences of opinion. And you can have differences of opinion about this investment or that investment. I think we are already in a very complex place with our allies and trying to figure out where we can build common yards with similarly high fences. Imagine trying to do that with investment as well. I think it's going to be challenging. I understand that the global ship is shifting toward interdependence and the intersection of commerce and national security, but you can't do it all at once. So I would say be super careful, because we could end up in a worse off place.
Great. Amy or Sam, any thoughts on this one from you? All right, let's go back to the cues that we've got in the list here. So I think we had acknowledged this at the top of the program, but interestingly, our trade numbers with China are back up. We are looking good, despite the fact that we've got export controls, that we've got concerns about trade on both sides. Is this an indication that the markets really could care less what governments are doing, and people just want their stuff, or is there something more here? Is the economic relationship actually stronger than maybe we give it the benefit of the doubt?
I'll dive into that first. I do think there is, despite national security considerations in many areas of our trading relationship, it's not in all. And so when we do talk about the positive trade numbers from last year, it was a lot of American consumers buying a lot of Chinese exports. That's what drove it for most of the year, right? And to a lesser extent, of course, U.S. products going to China. And so what's interesting to me is that the tariffs didn't adversely impact that, haven't adversely impacted that. If we look back to 2018 to now, clearly those tariffs are baked into trade. Not to say we like them, we want them off. They are a tax, and producers and consumers share the cost of those taxes, but I do think we can say they're baked in. Now, I think what is very, very interesting, looking at the economic reality of 2023, the Chinese government is already talking a lot about the fact that they don't anticipate the same growth numbers coming in. They just barely eked out maybe at 3% growth last year. Many estimates say it's lower. It was lower than that. But they are relying on an increase in consumption in 2023 in order to stabilize the economy and revitalize economic growth. And that is going to require a lot of in-China purchasing of goods and services. And so there is a lot, again, this was, I think, one of the few bright spots for us in talking about national security and trade, and that is a lot of that domestic consumption in China isn't dependent on national security issues, although it's maybe national security adjacent, as Sam was saying to us, given China's restrictions potentially on service providers when it comes to data, for example. But I do think what 2022 showed us was, yes, there is still a real demand in the United States, in China, for these purchases that require our two countries to trade with one another. I do think a lot of the producers and a lot of the investments are getting really spooked by this national security overlay that's getting heavier and heavier on the trade relationship. And we're going to see that impact, I think, trade numbers in 2023. Whether China will continue to invite foreign players to play as significant a role as we can in their domestic consumption story remains to be seen. The Chinese government is saying, of course, they're wide open for foreign investment, but these issues that we started talking about at the top of the hour of the political challenges in U.S.-China relations could lead to some considerations there, like the grumblings that we're hearing about, yes, the Chinese don't retaliate against maybe American investors in China selling goods, but what about those solar panel exports to the United States? Are those the kinds of restrictions China is going to put in place where it does control supply chains and could adversely affect the United States and others if it shuts that spigot off?
Yeah. Scott, thoughts on the trade numbers?
Sure. Those trade numbers definitely mask a lot of change that is occurring beneath the surface. The proportion of Chinese trade with the United States that is processing trade, intermediate goods, has dropped dramatically from somewhere around 35% to around 20%. We're still selling each other a bunch of stuff, but it's mostly end user stuff, right? As opposed to, here's the widget that you put into the thing that makes the next big thing. That suggests what we're seeing is diversification of supply chains net away from China, even if the overall number is there. And so you see companies moving portions of their production for the rest of the world to India, Vietnam, Mexico, other places. No, not everything, because that absorptive capacity is only so much, and production in China is really very convenient and high quality, et cetera. But you're seeing some of that. Looking ahead, we did a survey we published last October of Taiwanese companies, and we said, we asked them, have you started to move some of your sourcing or production from China? 26% said they had already started, mostly to Southeast Asia. Another 33% said they were considering it. Now, we finished that survey the day before House Speaker Pelosi landed in Taipei. So it was a wonderful test of an event and what was happening. Taiwanese companies are also moving from Taiwan. About a third of them beginning to move. They're afraid of war, supply chains, tech restrictions, zero COVID, just general lack of confidence in China. So I think Amy and Sam probably know this better than me because they talk to business CEOs more than me. What are the anxieties they have about business in China? I bet you probably pretty darn high. Last thing I'll mention, when I was in China, I didn't run into a single foreign tourist. Zero, not a one. No one in a fancy bus or a backpack. I came across very few foreign students in China. Those are the folks that are the future of doing business in China, investing in China, doing R&D in China, connectivity. I think we're in the middle of seeing some really big shifts that it's very difficult for us to get a spotlight on and understand all of it. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of individual signals or anecdotes that show me that really nothing is changing. I think we're seeing bigger changes that we just need to wait for more data to sum it up.
Great. Thanks, Scott. One of the other questions that came in is one that was going to require, I suspect, a wide variety of speculation from each of you. And Sam, I'm going to start with you on this one because a couple of weeks ago, you were actually in front of a congressional committee. What should we be expecting from Congress on China this year in particular?
Well, I can speak to one area. So I testified before the House Energy and Commerce Committee, a new committee, the subcommittee on innovation, data, and commerce. And we heard a wide range of China issues. But the part that was surprising and new to me was the use of the sort of China national security threat as a justification to get a US federal privacy law forward. And there was bipartisan convergence between Republicans and Democrats. They'll squabble about the ins and outs of data minimization or preemption in California, but at the end of the day, both parties want to get a privacy bill to the floor. And in the current environment, what's the best way to do that? Hang it on the China threat. As I told Chair Rogers, typically I am against using China as a hook to grapple with any complicated domestic regulatory issue. But in this case, I do believe that having federal privacy law is a way to both address data security risks related to China, as well as a range of broad actors at home and abroad, because you're focusing on securing the data, not the nationality, and that's good for everybody. So that's the first one. Obviously, a lot of questions about TikTok came up. There also were questions, and I think this is new. Congress is going to be increasingly interested in autonomous vehicles. And so as we look at sort of what are the next targets of scrutiny when it comes to cross-border commerce and Chinese firms in certain sectors, I think that there is an increasing new growing focus on the issue of Chinese autonomous vehicles that I would also watch as well.
Thanks, Sam. Amy, Scott, what are you hearing?
I'll zoom out and just say, that I think this Congress isn't going to pass a lot of legislation. They're going to be quite activist in their investigations and calling hearings. And so I think from our clients, a lot of concern over being called before a congressional committee to justify what they're doing with China or what they're considering doing with China, whether it's welcoming Chinese investment, co-investment here in the United States. Ford has something to say about that this week, or justifying their sales in China, their investments in China, their continued activity in the China market. Because as we were hearing in the last session, and we've been discussing here today, these concerns about the impact of American economic activity in undermining our national security interests is something that members of Congress really want to hear from, I think, stakeholders on Wall Street, as well as our manufacturers, as well as other entities that have ties to China. So I think that's going to be really something that we're all going to be looking out for this year.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Scott.
I just piggyback on those comments. Two things. When I was in China in the fall, I got a ride in a Chinese autonomous vehicle. I'm here to talk to you now, so it went okay. And I'll say that the Chinese are working on this, and every Chinese car that is produced now, whether or not it's electric, is connected, and it's collecting data and transmitting data, whether that's about what movie you want to watch, what food you want to buy, or where this vehicle should go, right? So I would expect attention, and I think that it's appropriate to do so. One thing that I really would, I don't know if this new committee or is are going to do, I hope that they do a lot of information collecting and research gathering and open-ended questions to try and really understand what's going on. I still think there's a lot that we need to understand. And related to that, we've heard a lot about folks, getting out their passports and getting ready to do some traveling and buy some tickets to go to some places. And so I think we'll see some folks go to Taipei. I would encourage them, as they've done before many times to Congress's benefit, is to travel to China. Go visit, look around, see what you can find out. You're there to collect info and share information. And I think it's really important that Chinese policymakers and business people and scholars understand how serious Congress is about addressing these issues to protect American national security and our competitiveness. And there's no better people to share that and convey that than the members of Congress themselves.
Thanks, Scott. We are rapidly nearing the end of our time together. So let me give a few closing thoughts just from my perspective of some other things to maybe keep in mind, and then I'll turn it over to Ken to officially close us out. First one is that I think, Amy, you kind of touched on it and your reference to Florida, but I will say that I think keeping an eye on what's happening, not just in Washington, but on state legislatures is something that those of us who follow China policy increasingly have to do. Whether it's the restrictions that not just Florida, but Texas as well are considering about whether Chinese citizens or corporations can buy land in their states. Those restrictions are certainly there. Several states have restrictions in terms of the purchase of Chinese technology that are either in place or underway. So I would encourage anybody who's on this call, don't think that just because it's not happening in Washington, that nothing is happening in these areas. I think the state and local front is one of the new frontiers in this, and is one that I don't know that necessarily get to that point, Scott, that you were making in terms of, is the information being gathered before a decision is being made? State governors and state legislators are a lot closer to their constituents on a day-to-day basis. And so whether that means that the policy is reflective of the mood or what an actual policy interest is, one to definitely keep an eye on. Sam, you mentioned in passing TikTok. I will note something that I also am keeping an eye on, just to be interested to see how it evolves, if at all. Back in the Trump administration, there was a restriction on WeChat, and as well as some of the other kind of Chinese social media companies. I think those were interesting policies that the Biden administration largely ended, but Congress obviously is focusing on some of these areas, and these are the ones that have those potential unintended consequences, because the parent company of WeChat also does a great deal of online payment. So for those of us who sell things to Chinese consumers and they use it on their phone, whether that phone is programming where their car is going or what next computer it is that they're going to buy, policies that are too broadly focused may have those unintended consequences of maybe attempting to protect what U.S. Interests are, but at the same time harm U.S. interests in some ways as well. So the good news for those of us who are China watchers is there is no shortage of things that need to be watched, problems that need to be solved, and potentially a shortage of people coming up with those solutions. So Amy, Scott, Sam, thank you so much for your feedback. This was a great discussion. And with that, Ken, back to you.
Thank you all very, very much. Really great conversation. Validated my interest in bringing Amy, Sam, and Aaron back, and Scott, and inviting you on for this discussion. I seem to feel like these issues are not going to go away in the next 12 months. So maybe just keep your calendars open. We'll set a date and I'll be back in touch. I did, while your panel was going on though, write my first trade Valentine. It's a haiku. So here it goes. Balloons should bring joy, not tensions between partners. Engagement builds trust. Not perfect, but hey, I was trying to wing it while I was listening in. So thank you all for sticking with us. Tomorrow we'll kick things off in person at 9 a.m. in Eastern time in the Ronald Reagan Building.